If you're overwhelmed and stressed out with your job and you're facing challenging situations every day when you go into the office, you may be wondering whether or not you're working in a toxic workplace. I'm Mike from Cashion Legal, and in this video, I'm going to cover the topic of the toxic workplace. At the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding about whether or not you are working in a toxic workplace, and if you are, what options you might have in this circumstance. At the outset, I want to make it clear that being in a toxic workplace is one of the more challenging situations that you can face as an employee. If you're working in a toxic workplace, you may be dealing with high levels of stress and anxiety that are having impacts well beyond your working environment. In these situations, it's really challenging to not bring the stress associated with these situations with you when you come home. So what makes these situations really hard to deal with is it often requires you to balance your professional goals with other priorities. You may find yourself in a circumstance where you have to weigh your personal well-being against whatever career aspirations you have. Being that the path forward is often not clear in these situations, this is a situation where you can really benefit from strong legal advice. So if you are overwhelmed with your working environment, do not hesitate to click the link to our website in the description of this video and book a consultation with our office today. With that out of the way, let's talk about some of the legal concepts that are relevant to assessing whether or not you're in a toxic workplace. In order to understand whether or not you are working in a toxic workplace, it is helpful to be familiar with the legal concepts that underpin any legal action you can take in these situations. The most important legal concept to understand for this situation is the concept of constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal refers to any situation where an employer breaches an employment agreement with an employee such that the employee is entitled to resign and treat themselves as having been dismissed. Constructive dismissal often arises where the employer commits one single breach of the employment agreement, like a salary reduction or a demotion. However, constructive dismissal can also be established where the employer has engaged in a course of conduct that demonstrates it no longer intends to be bound by the employment contract. This can occur if an employee's working environment has become intolerable and the employer refuses to do anything about it. Instead of one single change resulting in a constructive dismissal, this is a series of acts by an employer that prohibits the employee from carrying out the responsibilities of their role. In the context of a toxic workplace claim, it's important to note that employers have a legal obligation to foster a workplace of civility, decency, and respect. This is an implied term in every employment contract in Alberta. By fostering or failing to meaningfully address a toxic workplace, the employer has breached this obligation, which is why this may give rise to a claim for constructive dismissal. So when assessing whether or not you are working in a toxic workplace and can claim constructive dismissal, this is the first question we have to ask. Has the employer failed to foster a workplace of civility, decency, and respect such that you're unable to carry out the basic expectations of your role? There is a major qualification on the concept of constructive dismissal that's important to be aware of when assessing whether or not you are working in a toxic workplace. This important qualification is that constructive dismissal is an objective analysis. This means that in order to establish a toxic workplace claim and prove constructive dismissal, it must be proven that the reasonable objective person would figure that the employee had no other option but to resign in these circumstances. This objective standard can be easy in some constructive dismissal claims, like salary reductions or demotions, but it is particularly difficult in toxic workplace claims. That's because any toxic workplace claim is dependent, to a certain extent at least, on the individual's subjective experiences. It can be very difficult to present these subjective experiences in a way that satisfies the objective standard. In the absence of some objective evidence, it can be very difficult to establish that the tension and stress that you are experiencing rises to the level of constituting a toxic workplace. Because of this objective standard, we generally only encourage people to pursue toxic workplace claims in the clearest of circumstances. Having said all that, there are some situations where it is relatively easy to establish that someone is working in a toxic work environment. For example, if you are regularly subjected to harassment or bullying in the workplace and your employer isn't taking any steps to address this conduct, this would likely constitute a valid constructive dismissal claim. Another scenario where you might be able to establish a toxic workplace claim is in the context of unwarranted criticism. If you're repeatedly subject to criticism for failing to reach a standard that hasn't been clearly communicated to you in the past, or failing to reach a standard that has no reasonable connection to the expectations of your role, this would also likely constitute a toxic workplace claim. Finally, another scenario where we have seen successful toxic workplace claims is where an employer is failing to adhere to a statutory duty that it owes to you. Employment law is governed by various different pieces of legislation, including the Employment Standards Code, Alberta's Human Rights Act, and the Occupational Health and Safety legislation. So now that we've answered the questions about what is a toxic workplace and what are some examples of toxic workplaces, let's move on to the question of what you should do if you find yourself in this situation. If you do find yourself in a toxic workplace, I encourage you to seek legal advice as soon as possible. Our employment lawyers can help you understand whether or not you're working in a toxic workplace and what you can do about it. These are complex and dynamic situations, and our team can assist you by navigating this scenario towards an acceptable outcome. But apart from seeking legal advice, what else should you do? The number one rule is to document everything. As I explained earlier, constructive dismissal is assessed on an objective standard. So in this context, detailed notes about the treatment that you're being subjected to can prove to be a very helpful piece of evidence if you do ultimately pursue a toxic workplace claim. That's because contemporaneous notes are seen as more reliable than your recollection of what was going on in the past. In addition to documenting everything, the number two thing you should do is communicate your concerns to your employer to the extent that you are able to do so. If your employer has an established mechanism for dealing with these types of concerns, reporting your circumstances to your employer may resolve the situation altogether. If your employer can address this without directly involving legal counsel, this is obviously a good outcome. Having said all that, I acknowledge in certain circumstances there may be insufficient infrastructure for you to report these concerns to your employer. If that is the case, you may need to consult with legal counsel before trying to address the situation directly. To finalize that last point, I always like to emphasize that you need to be respectful and professional when communicating with your employer, because failing to do so can carry negative consequences for you. My third and final piece of advice is to act quickly. In constructive dismissal claims where the employees don't act quickly enough to address their situation, sometimes courts will say this amounts to condonation of the conduct. In the context of toxic workplace claims, because you are trying to establish that the objective, reasonable person felt you had no choice but to resign in the circumstances, allowing the situation to persist for a period of time hurts that argument. For this reason, it's important to take steps to address the situation as soon as possible. Finally, I want to emphasize that constructive dismissal is a very serious remedy because it involves you resigning from your employment and then pursuing legal action against your employer. This is obviously a very precarious situation for you, so I recommend you only do so with the benefit of legal advice. The bottom line is that toxic workplace situations are very difficult to deal with. In addition to being stressful and overwhelming, they are legally complicated, and they require you to make difficult decisions about your life and career. If you think you might be working in a toxic workplace, we can assist you with this. We provide employees who are working through toxic workplace claims with clarity about their circumstances, strategies for next steps, and peace of mind through sound advice and strong representation. If you're looking for assistance, you can click the link to our website in the description of this video and book a consultation with our office today.